I thought I was driving to my husband's will, reading that Tuesday morning in Los Angeles, just another step in settling Richard's affairs after his sudden passing 3 months earlier. The parking lot outside the law offices on Wilshire Boulevard was nearly empty at 9 in the morning. As I reached for my car door handle, a homeless man came running toward me, his weathered face twisted with panic. "Ma'am, don't start that engine, your daughter-in-law!" He screamed, his voice cracking with urgency. My blood froze in my veins. When I walked into that office 10 minutes later, my daughter-in-law Brittany nearly collapsed when she saw me alive. 3 months earlier, my life had seemed absolutely perfect. Richard and I had been married for 35 wonderful years, building our home in a quiet Pasadena neighborhood where the jacaranda trees lined every street and neighbors still waved to each other from their front porches. Our son Derek had grown into a successful real estate developer at 32, and when he married Brittany 2 years ago, I welcomed her with open arms. She was 28, blonde, petite, with a warm smile that could light up any room. Her background in pharmaceutical sales made her seem so knowledgeable about everything medical, which became incredibly valuable when Richard started having heart problems. The night Richard died was burned into my memory forever. We had gone to bed early around 10 o'clock after watching our usual evening news. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to find Richard clutching his chest, gasping for air. I called 911 immediately, but by the time the paramedics arrived, my beloved husband was gone. The doctor at Huntington Hospital explained that Richard had suffered a massive heart attack, likely brought on by the stress from his recent diagnosis of coronary artery disease. His cardiologist, Dr. Martinez, had prescribed new medication just the week before, adjusting his dosage to manage his condition better. The funeral arrangements fell into place with surprising ease, thanks entirely to Brittany's incredible organization. She seemed to anticipate my every need before I even knew what I needed myself. While I sat in my living room overwhelmed by grief and the endless stream of visitors offering casseroles and condolences, Brittany handled everything. She contacted the funeral home, arranged for the flowers, wrote the obituary, and even coordinated with Richard's business associates who wanted to attend the service. Her efficiency was remarkable, though I noticed she seemed particularly interested in speaking privately with Richard's business partner, Frank Morrison, who had been Richard's closest collaborator in their construction company for over 15 years. After the funeral, Brittany suggested she move into our guest room temporarily to help me through the initial adjustment period. Derek was traveling constantly for his real estate projects, often spending weeks in San Francisco or Seattle, scouting new development opportunities. Having Brittany around felt like such a blessing during those dark, early weeks. She cooked my meals, handled phone calls from lawyers and insurance companies, and even managed to organize Richard's chaotic home office, which had been his domain for decades. But as the weeks passed, I began noticing things that struck me as unusual. Brittany would receive phone calls late at night, speaking in hushed tones that stopped abruptly whenever I entered the room. She explained these were clients from her previous pharmaceutical job calling at odd hours due to different time zones. She had apparently maintained some consulting relationships even after marrying Derek. When delivery trucks arrived with legal documents, Brittany would intercept them before I could see what they contained, explaining that she was trying to protect me from unnecessary stress during my grieving period. The most concerning development came when Brittany began having lengthy private conversations with Frank Morrison about Richard's share of their construction business. She explained that the company needed immediate decisions about ongoing projects and contracts, and since I knew nothing about construction, she felt qualified to represent my interests based on her business background. Frank seemed receptive to her involvement, which surprised me since he had always been somewhat formal and reserved around family members, preferring to keep business and personal relationships separate. One evening while Brittany was out running errands, I discovered a folder of legal documents she had left on the kitchen counter. The papers appeared to be preliminary agreements for selling Richard's portion of the construction company to Frank Morrison at what seemed like a significantly reduced price. When I asked Brittany about these documents later that night, she became visibly flustered, explaining that she was simply exploring options to simplify my financial situation. She insisted that managing a business partnership would be too overwhelming for me in my current emotional state, and that converting Richard's share to liquid assets would provide more security for my future. Her logic seemed reasonable. Something about her eagerness to handle these matters troubled me deeply. Richard had always been so proud of the company he and Frank had built, from nothing starting with small residential projects and eventually winning contracts for major commercial developments throughout Los Angeles County. The idea of selling his life's work so quickly after his death felt like betraying his memory somehow. The climactic moment of this period came on a Thursday evening when I decided to bring Brittany a cup of tea while she was on one of her late-night phone calls. As I approached the guest room, I heard her speaking in a tone I had never heard before, cold and calculating. "The old woman is getting suspicious about the business arrangements," she was saying to whoever was on the other end of the call. "We need to speed up the timeline before she starts asking too many questions or decides to get her own lawyer involved." When I knocked on the door moments later with her tea, her voice immediately returned to its usual sweet, caring tone as she thanked me and said goodnight to her supposed pharmaceutical client. The weeks following that overheard conversation brought a series of troubling changes that I could no longer dismiss as coincidences. My prescription medications, which had always lasted exactly 30 days as prescribed, began running out after only 3 weeks. When I mentioned this to Brittany, she claimed that Dr. Martinez had called to increase my dosages due to grief-related anxiety and depression. The higher doses made me feel dizzy and confused, often leaving me disoriented enough that I would forget conversations we had just had or lose track of what day it was. Brittany seemed to encourage this mental fog, frequently reminding me about appointments I supposedly had made, but could not remember, or documents I had allegedly signed during my confused moments. She began keeping a notebook of my daily activities, claiming it was to help me stay organized, but I noticed she often wrote things I was certain I had never said or done. When I questioned these entries, she would look at me with such genuine concern that I began doubting my own memory. My neighbor across the street, Mrs. Patterson, had lived in the neighborhood for over 40 years and had become a close friend during my decades in Pasadena. She was the type of woman who noticed everything happening on our quiet street, from which lawns needed watering to when packages sat too long on doorsteps. One afternoon, while I was checking my mailbox, Mrs. Patterson mentioned seeing Derek's silver Toyota Camry in my driveway several times during the previous week, always very late at night or very early in the morning. This information confused me greatly since Derek had told me he was working on a major development project in Sacramento and would not be returning to Los Angeles until the following month. When I mentioned Mrs. Patterson's observation to Brittany, she quickly explained that Derek had been making brief visits to handle urgent paperwork related to Richard's estate, but had specifically asked her not to mention these visits because he did not want to burden me with business details during my grieving process. Her explanation seemed plausible, but I wondered why Derek would not at least say hello to his own mother during these mysterious visits. The most disturbing discovery came when I was looking for extra blankets in the guest room closet while Brittany was at the grocery store. Behind a stack of towels, I found a manila folder containing legal documents that made my heart race. The papers appeared to be power of attorney forms already filled out with my signature, giving Brittany complete authority over my financial and medical decisions. I was absolutely certain I had never signed these documents yet. The signature looked remarkably similar to my own handwriting. When I confronted Brittany about these papers upon her return, she maintained her calm, caring demeanor while explaining that we had completed these forms together during one of my confused periods the previous week. She claimed I had been feeling overwhelmed by the responsibility of managing Richard's complex estate and had asked her to help by taking on some of the decision-making burden. According to her version of events, I had insisted that having legal authority would make it easier for her to handle various administrative tasks without constantly bothering me for signatures and approvals. The conversation took an even more troubling turn when Brittany began suggesting that my recent memory problems might indicate a need for professional medical evaluation. She mentioned several lovely assisted living facilities in the area that specialized in caring for widows who were struggling with cognitive decline following the loss of their spouses. Her research into these facilities seemed remarkably thorough for someone who had supposedly just begun considering this option. She had brochures, pricing information, and even contact names of admissions counselors at 3 different locations. Brittany's concern appeared so genuine, and my own confusion about recent events had become so frequent that I actually began wondering whether she might be right about my mental state. The medications were making me feel foggy and disconnected, and I was indeed having trouble remembering conversations and decisions from just days earlier. Maybe I was experiencing some form of grief-related dementia that required professional intervention. But something deep in my gut kept insisting that these developments were not natural or normal. Richard had always praised my sharp mind and excellent memory, often joking that I could remember details from conversations we had decades ago, while he could barely remember what we had discussed the day before. The idea that I would suddenly develop severe memory problems within just a few months of his death seemed inconsistent with everything I knew about myself and my family medical history. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening when I could not sleep due to anxiety about my deteriorating mental state. I decided to make myself a cup of chamomile tea and maybe read for a while to calm my nerves. As I passed by the guest room, I heard Brittany speaking on the phone again in that same cold, calculated tone that had disturbed me weeks earlier. This time, her words were even more chilling. "The old woman is starting to remember things she should not remember," she was saying. "We might need to increase the dosage again, but we have to be careful not to make it obvious. The timeline is getting tight, and we cannot afford any complications before the will reading next month." Unable to sleep after overhearing Brittany's ominous phone conversation, I waited until I was certain she was asleep before making my way to Richard's home office in the basement. This room had been his sanctuary for 35 years, filled with filing cabinets containing decades of business records, family documents, and personal papers that he had meticulously organized according to his own unique system. After his death, Brittany had offered to help me sort through these documents, but I had insisted on handling this particular task myself when I felt emotionally ready. The basement office still smelled like Richard's cologne and the cherry pipe tobacco he had enjoyed on special occasions. His massive oak desk dominated the room, surrounded by metal filing cabinets labeled with topics ranging from tax records to insurance policies to business contracts. I began systematically searching through the files looking for Richard's will and any other documents that might explain Brittany's mysterious behavior and urgent timeline. In the filing cabinet labeled Estate Planning, I found Richard's original will dated 5 years earlier, which left our entire estate to me with the understanding that everything would eventually pass to Derek after my death. The language was clear and straightforward, reflecting Richard's practical nature and his desire to ensure my financial security for the rest of my life. However, tucked behind this original document, I discovered a draft of what appeared to be a revised will dated just 1 week before Richard's death. This draft version contained dramatically different provisions that made my blood run cold. While it still left the majority of our assets to me initially, it included a complex clause stating that if I died within 6 months of Richard's death, the entire estate would be divided equally between Derek and Brittany, bypassing the normal inheritance sequence entirely. The timing seemed extraordinarily suspicious given that Richard had never mentioned any intention to modify his will, and the provisions seemed designed to benefit Derek and Brittany rather than protecting my interests. As I continued searching through Richard's papers, I discovered something even more disturbing in a folder labeled Personal Research. Richard had apparently been investigating Brittany's background during the weeks before his death, and what he had found was deeply troubling. Brittany's previous employment in pharmaceutical sales was accurate, but her specialization had been in cardiac medications, specifically drugs used to treat heart rhythm disorders and blood pressure problems. Richard had printed several articles about digitalis poisoning and other methods of inducing heart attacks that would be difficult to detect during routine autopsies. The most shocking discovery was Richard's personal journal, which he had hidden in a secret compartment behind the bottom drawer of his desk. His entries during the final month of his life revealed growing suspicions about Brittany's behavior and her unusual interest in his medical treatment. Richard had noticed that his heart medication seemed to be disappearing faster than it should, requiring more frequent refill requests that puzzled his cardiologist. He had also become concerned about episodes of dizziness and confusion that did not seem consistent with his prescribed dosage levels. Richard's final journal entry dated the day before his death was the most devastating evidence of all. He had written, "I confronted Brittany today about my suspicions regarding my medication. Her reaction confirmed my worst fears. She became defensive and angry, insisting that I was paranoid and imagining problems that did not exist. But I have been carefully monitoring my pill counts, and I know someone has been tampering with my medication. Tomorrow I am calling my lawyer to change my will back to the original version and to add provisions protecting Kendall if anything happens to me under suspicious circumstances." The journal entry continued, "I also plan to contact Detective Maria Santos, who worked with me on the fraud case involving our construction company 3 years ago. If my suspicions are correct, Brittany and possibly Derek are planning something terrible, and I need to ensure that Kendall will be protected and that justice will be served if anything happens to me. I have hidden copies of all my research in the safe deposit box at First National Bank, along with instructions for Maria to investigate if I die suddenly." As I read these words written in Richard's familiar handwriting just hours before his death, the full scope of the conspiracy became terrifyingly clear. Richard had been murdered, and I was being systematically poisoned and manipulated as part of an elaborate scheme to steal our entire estate. The will reading that was scheduled for the following month was clearly the deadline for my own planned death, ensuring that Derek and Brittany would inherit everything before anyone could discover the truth about Richard's murder. The realization that my own son might be involved in his father's murder and planning my death was almost too devastating to comprehend. Derek had always been ambitious and somewhat materialistic, but I had never imagined he could be capable of such evil. Yet the evidence was undeniable: the mysterious late-night visits that Mrs. Patterson had witnessed, the power of attorney documents with my forged signature, and Brittany's pharmaceutical expertise that made her the perfect person to commit these murders without detection. I carefully photographed every document with my cell phone and returned everything to its original location, making sure not to leave any evidence that I had discovered Richard's research. As I climbed the stairs back to the main floor of the house, I could hear Brittany moving around in the guest room, probably making another one of her late-night phone calls to coordinate the final stages of their murderous plan. The most terrifying realization was that I was now living under the same roof as someone who had already killed my husband and was actively working to kill me as well. Every meal she prepared, every medication she handed me, and every gesture of caring support was actually another step in her plan to end my life before the will reading could expose their scheme. The next morning, I forced myself to behave exactly as I had during the previous weeks, maintaining the facade of a confused and grateful widow while secretly beginning my own investigation. Every interaction with Brittany required careful calculation, as I needed to appear increasingly frail and dependent, while actually gathering evidence that could bring her and Derek to justice for Richard's murder. My first priority was locating the homeless man who Richard had mentioned in some of his business papers. According to the records, I found Eddie Sullivan had been a longtime construction worker for Richard and Frank's company until Derek had him fired 18 months ago for supposedly stealing tools from a job site. Richard's notes suggested that Eddie had actually discovered Derek embezzling money from construction contracts and had been fired to silence him before he could report the theft. I found Eddie living in a makeshift shelter behind a fast food restaurant about 6 miles from my house, in an area where several homeless individuals had created a small community among the dumpsters and abandoned shopping carts. Despite his weathered appearance and worn clothing, Eddie's eyes were sharp and alert when I approached him. When I mentioned Richard's name, his entire demeanor changed from suspicious wariness to genuine grief. Eddie explained that Richard had been the only boss who had ever treated him with real respect, giving him opportunities to learn new skills and advance within the company despite his lack of formal education. When Derek took over more responsibilities in the business, Eddie had noticed discrepancies in supply orders and labor reports that suggested someone was skimming money from various projects. When he brought these concerns to Derek directly, he was accused of theft and fired immediately, with Derek threatening to have him arrested if he ever set foot on another company job site. More importantly for my current situation, Eddie revealed that he had been keeping watch on my house since Richard's funeral, worried about my safety, based on things he had witnessed in the days before Richard's death. According to Eddie, he had seen Brittany meeting with Frank Morrison multiple times in parking lots around the neighborhood, always in locations where they would not be noticed by neighbors or family members. During one of these meetings, Eddie had observed Brittany handing Frank a small bottle that looked like prescription medication. Eddie agreed to help me gather evidence against Brittany and Derek in exchange for my promise to clear his name and give him legitimate employment once the truth was exposed. His construction background made him skilled at surveillance and documentation, and his homeless status meant he could observe my house and Brittany's activities without attracting attention. We established a communication system using prepaid cell phones that Brittany would not be able to monitor or trace. Over the following 2 weeks, Eddie and I worked together to document every aspect of Brittany's conspiracy. Eddie followed her during her supposed grocery shopping trips and discovered that she was actually meeting with Derek at various locations around Los Angeles, planning the details of my upcoming murder. They had apparently decided that a car accident would be the most effective method, as it would appear completely unrelated to Richard's heart attack and would not trigger any investigation into potential poisoning. Meanwhile, I began secretly recording my conversations with Brittany using a small digital recorder that Eddie had obtained for me. These recordings revealed the full scope of her manipulation as she continued encouraging me to sign additional documents and discussing my supposed mental decline with fake concern. She was particularly eager to have me sign a medical directive that would give her authority to make end of life decisions on my behalf, supposedly to spare Derek the burden of such difficult choices. The most damning evidence came when I discovered how Brittany had been poisoning both Richard and me. She had been crushing small amounts of Richard's heart medication and adding the powder to different foods and beverages, creating an overdose effect that would eventually cause the massive heart attack that killed him. For me, she was using a different approach, adding mild sedatives to my coffee and tea that created the confusion and memory problems I had been experiencing. The goal was to make me appear mentally incompetent, justifying her use of the forged power of attorney documents. Eddie's surveillance revealed that Derek had been embezzling money from the construction company for over 2 years, using the funds to finance failed real estate investments that had left him deeply in debt. The inheritance money from Richard's estate was intended to cover these debts and provide enough additional funds for Derek and Brittany to relocate to Costa Rica, where they planned to start a new life with new identities. Frank Morrison was apparently unaware of the murder plot, but was complicit in the embezzlement scheme, agreeing to buy Richard's share of the company at a reduced price in exchange for Derek's promise to keep their financial irregularities secret. The timeline for my murder was moved up dramatically when Brittany received news that the will reading had been rescheduled for the following week due to a change in the lawyer's schedule. This meant that Derek and Brittany needed to eliminate me within just a few days to ensure that the modified will provisions would take effect before the original will could be read and validated. Eddie overheard their phone conversations discussing plans to tamper with my car's brakes, causing a fatal accident that would appear to be the result of my supposed mental confusion and medication-related impairment. As the date of my planned murder approached, I contacted Detective Maria Santos, whose name Richard had mentioned in his journal. Maria had worked with Richard on a fraud investigation involving their construction company several years earlier and had developed great respect for his integrity and attention to detail. When I explained the situation and provided copies of all the evidence Eddie and I had gathered, Maria immediately understood the seriousness of the threat and began coordinating with other investigators to prepare a comprehensive response. The most challenging aspect of this period was maintaining my performance as a confused and dependent widow while actually orchestrating a complex plan to expose Derek and Brittany's crimes. Every morning when Brittany brought me coffee laced with sedatives, I had to pretend to drink it while actually disposing of the liquid when she was not watching. Every time she encouraged me to sign additional legal documents, I had to appear compliant while actually documenting everything for the police investigation. The night before the scheduled will reading, Eddie confirmed that Derek had indeed tampered with my car's brake lines, ensuring that the brakes would fail completely within the first few miles of driving. This was intended to cause a fatal accident during my drive to the lawyer's office, eliminating me just hours before the will reading could reveal the truth about Richard's original intentions for our estate. The morning of the will reading arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that made Los Angeles seem almost surreal in its perfection. I woke early knowing that this would be either the day I exposed Derek and Brittany's murderous conspiracy or the day they succeeded in killing me to cover their crimes. The weight of the hidden recording device in my purse felt both reassuring and terrifying as I prepared for what Detective Santos had described as the most dangerous day of my life. Brittany was unusually attentive during breakfast, bringing me coffee and toast, while repeatedly expressing her concern about my emotional state during such a difficult milestone. Her performance of caring support was so convincing that I almost admired her acting ability, even while knowing that every gesture was calculated to maintain her facade until my planned death later that morning. She reminded me multiple times about the importance of following the lawyer's advice regarding estate planning, subtly reinforcing her expectation that the modified will would be the version read during today's meeting. Detective Santos and her team had spent the previous evening installing surveillance equipment throughout the law office building and coordinating with Eddie to ensure that every aspect of Derek and Brittany's plan would be documented and recorded for prosecution. The goal was not simply to prevent my murder, but to gather enough evidence to convict both Derek and Brittany for Richard's murder, as well as their attempted murder of me. As I prepared to leave for the lawyer's office, Brittany made a point of walking me to my car and expressing her regret that Derek's business obligations prevented him from attending such an important family event. She mentioned that Derek was supposedly meeting with potential investors in San Diego, but would call later to hear about the results of the will reading. Of course, Eddie's surveillance had already confirmed that Derek was actually waiting in a location about 2 miles from the law office, ready to receive Brittany's phone call, confirming that my car accident had occurred as planned. The moment I stepped outside and approached my car, Eddie came running across the parking lot, his weathered face twisted with genuine panic and concern. His performance was absolutely convincing as he screamed his warning about not starting the engine, creating the exact scenario that Brittany had heard described but could not have anticipated. The shock on Brittany's face was unmistakable when she realized that her plan had been discovered and that I was still alive when I should have been dead from brake failure miles away from the house. Eddie's warning gave me the perfect excuse to leave my car in the driveway and call a taxi to take me to the lawyer's office, completely avoiding the trap that Derek had set, while making it impossible for Brittany to prevent my attendance at the will reading without revealing her own involvement in the conspiracy. As I climbed into the taxi, I could see Brittany frantically making phone calls, undoubtedly trying to warn Derek that their plan had failed and that I would actually be present when the will was read. The drive to the law office gave me time to review my strategy with Detective Santos via a brief phone call. The plan was for me to act surprised by whatever version of the will the lawyer presented, allowing Brittany to reveal her expectations and knowledge of documents that I had supposedly never seen. The recording device in my purse would capture her reactions and any statements that would confirm her involvement in the conspiracy to murder me and steal the inheritance. When I arrived at the law office on Wilshire Boulevard, Brittany was already waiting in the reception area, her usual composed demeanor showing cracks of strain that I had never seen before. She seemed genuinely shocked that I had survived the morning, and her attempts at normal conversation felt forced and artificial. The receptionist announced that the lawyer James Harrison was ready to meet with us in his conference room to discuss the details of Richard's estate. James Harrison was a distinguished man in his early 60s who had been Richard's lawyer for over 20 years, handling everything from business contracts to estate planning with meticulous attention to detail. What Brittany did not know was that Richard had contacted James just 2 days before his death, expressing concerns about potential threats to his safety and requesting modifications to his will that would protect me and ensure that justice would be served if anything suspicious happened to him. As we settled into the conference room, James began by expressing his condolences and explaining the general process for reading and validating Richard's will. Brittany's body language was tense and expectant, clearly anticipating that the modified version would be the document presented for validation. Her confidence seemed to waver slightly when James mentioned that Richard had made some last-minute changes to his estate planning just before his death changes that had required additional legal documentation and witness verification. The pivotal moment came when James presented Richard's actual final will dated just 1 day before his death, which not only restored all original provisions leaving everything to me, but also included a special clause that I had never seen before. According to this clause, if I died within 1 year of Richard's death, under any circumstances that could be considered suspicious, the entire estate would be donated to charity, and law enforcement would be required to conduct a comprehensive investigation into both Richard's death and my own. Brittany's reaction to this revelation was immediate and unmistakable. Her face went completely pale, and she actually gasped audibly as she realized that her entire plan had been anticipated and countered by Richard before his death. The modified will that she and Derek had been counting on was revealed to be nothing more than a draft that Richard had never signed, meaning that all their planning and preparation had been based on a document that had no legal validity whatsoever. But the most devastating revelation was still to come. James explained that Richard had also left a sealed letter addressed to me to be opened only in the presence of law enforcement if any suspicious circumstances arose regarding his death or my welfare. As Detective Santos entered the conference room to witness the opening of this letter, Brittany's composure finally crumbled completely, and she began demanding to know why police were involved in what should have been a private family matter. Richard's letter, written in his own handwriting and witnessed by James Harrison, contained a complete confession of his suspicions about Brittany and Derek, along with detailed instructions for investigating his death and protecting my safety. The letter specifically mentioned his discovery of the embezzlement scheme, his evidence of medication tampering, and his certainty that Derek and Brittany were planning to murder both of us to steal the inheritance and cover their other crimes. As Detective Santos read Richard's letter aloud, Brittany's mask of innocence finally slipped entirely, revealing the cold, calculating personality that I had only glimpsed during her late-night phone conversations. She began making accusations against Eddie, claiming that he was a disgruntled former employee who was trying to frame her and Derek for crimes they had never committed. But her knowledge of details that only the actual perpetrators could have known made her protests sound increasingly desperate and unconvincing. The confrontation in the lawyer's office escalated quickly as Detective Santos presented the evidence that Eddie and I had gathered over the previous weeks. The recordings of Brittany's phone conversations were played for everyone to hear, revealing her discussions of timelines, dosages, and methods that left no doubt about her involvement in Richard's murder and the planned attempt on my life. Brittany's attempts to maintain her innocence became increasingly frantic as each piece of evidence was presented, demonstrating the comprehensive nature of her conspiracy. When Derek arrived at the law office responding to Brittany's panicked phone calls, he walked directly into the trap that Detective Santos had prepared. His first words upon entering the conference room were questions about whether the problem had been taken care of and whether they could proceed with their backup plan. These statements, captured on recording, provided immediate confirmation of his involvement in the conspiracy and his knowledge that something was supposed to have happened to prevent my attendance at the will reading. The technical evidence was equally damning. Derek's tampering with my car's brake system had been documented by police investigators, and the specific method he had used matched techniques that required professional knowledge of automotive systems. More importantly, the brake fluid found on Derek's clothing contained trace amounts of the same chemicals that had been used, confirming his direct involvement in preparing my planned murder. Brittany's pharmaceutical expertise became her downfall when investigators tested the remaining contents of Richard's heart medication bottles. The pills had been contaminated with additional cardiac drugs that would have created a deadly overdose when combined with Richard's prescribed dosage. Brittany's fingerprints were found on the medication bottles, and her purchase records showed that she had been buying additional cardiac medications using fake prescriptions that she had created using her pharmaceutical industry contacts. The financial investigation revealed the full scope of Derek's embezzlement from the construction company. Over 2 years, he had stolen more than $200,000 through fake contracts, inflated supply orders, and unauthorized bonuses that he had paid to himself and Brittany. The money had been used to cover Derek's gambling debts and failed real estate investments, leaving him desperately in need of the inheritance money to avoid bankruptcy and potential criminal prosecution for his business crimes. Frank Morrison's involvement in the embezzlement scheme was also exposed during the investigation. While he had not participated in the murder conspiracy, Frank had been complicit in covering Derek's thefts in exchange for promises of future business partnerships and profit-sharing arrangements. When confronted with evidence of his involvement, Frank immediately agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges and the opportunity to testify against Derek and Brittany. The most emotionally devastating moment came when Derek finally broke down under interrogation and revealed the full timeline of the conspiracy. According to his confession, Brittany had been planning Richard's murder almost from the beginning of her marriage to Derek, recognizing that the inheritance would solve all their financial problems and provide them with enough money to start fresh in another country. Derek had initially resisted the idea of murdering his own parents, but his mounting debts and fear of exposure for his embezzlement had eventually convinced him to participate in Brittany's plan. Derek's confession revealed that Brittany had been the driving force behind every aspect of the conspiracy, from the initial decision to poison Richard to the detailed planning of my own murder. She had researched methods of inducing heart attacks, obtained the necessary drugs through her pharmaceutical connections, and developed the timeline that would maximize their inheritance while minimizing the risk of detection. Derek had primarily served as her accomplice, providing information about the family finances and handling the mechanical aspects of sabotaging my car. The confession also revealed Brittany's contingency plans in case their initial attempts failed. If the car accident had not killed me, they were prepared to increase the dosage of sedatives in my food and beverages until I became completely incapacitated, at which point they would use the forged power of attorney documents to have me committed to a mental health facility, where Brittany could continue poisoning me without interference from other family members or medical professionals. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of Derek's confession was his description of Brittany's complete lack of remorse or emotional connection to the people she was murdering. According to Derek, Brittany had viewed Richard and me simply as obstacles to be removed, showing no more emotional consideration for our lives than she would for disposing of unwanted furniture or household items. Her ability to maintain the facade of a caring daughter-in-law while systematically planning our deaths demonstrated a level of psychological detachment that shocked even the experienced investigators. When confronted with Derek's confession and the overwhelming physical evidence, Brittany made one final attempt to manipulate the situation by claiming that she had been acting to protect me from Derek's abusive behavior and that all her actions had been motivated by concern for my welfare. She insisted that Derek had been threatening to harm me if she did not cooperate with his financial schemes, and that her apparent involvement in the conspiracy had actually been an attempt to gather evidence against Derek while keeping me safe. This final lie was easily disproven by the recordings Eddie and I had made of her phone conversations, which clearly showed her taking the leadership role in planning both murders and expressing frustration with Derek's reluctance to proceed with certain aspects of their plan. The recordings also captured her discussing specific details about poison dosages and timing that demonstrated her expertise and active participation rather than reluctant cooperation. The formal charges against Derek and Brittany included first-degree murder for Richard's death, attempted first-degree murder for the planned attack on me, elder abuse, fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit multiple felonies. The evidence was so comprehensive that both defendants were denied bail, as the judge determined that they posed an ongoing threat to public safety and had demonstrated a clear willingness to commit murder to achieve their goals. 6 months later, I sat in the courthouse as Derek received his sentence of 25 years to life for his role in his father's murder and the attempted murder of his own mother. The judge's words echoed in the silent courtroom as she described the betrayal of family trust as one of the most heinous aspects of his crimes. Derek's expression showed a mixture of grief and resignation that suggested he had finally begun to comprehend the full magnitude of what he had done and what he had lost forever. Brittany's trial had concluded 2 weeks earlier with a verdict of guilty on all charges, resulting in a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Throughout her trial, she had maintained her innocence and continued trying to manipulate everyone around her, including her own defense attorneys. The judge specifically noted that Brittany had shown no remorse for her victims and appeared to view the entire proceedings as simply another challenge to be managed through deception and manipulation. Frank Morrison received 3 years in prison for his role in the embezzlement scheme, but his cooperation with prosecutors and his genuine remorse for his actions had resulted in a significantly reduced sentence compared to what he might have faced. During his testimony, Frank had broken down while describing Richard as one of the most honest and principled men he had ever known, and his grief over his friend's death seemed completely genuine. The financial recovery process had been surprisingly straightforward once Derek and Brittany's crimes were exposed. The construction company was sold to a competitor who honored all existing contracts and retained most of the longtime employees, including Eddie Sullivan, who was promoted to a supervisory position after his role in exposing the conspiracy was recognized. The sale proceeds, combined with the life insurance settlements and other estate assets, provided me with considerably more financial security than I had expected. Eddie's transformation had been one of the most rewarding aspects of the entire ordeal. With steady employment, a decent apartment, and the respect of his co-workers, he had rebuilt his life in ways that demonstrated his fundamental character and resilience. He visited me regularly, and we had developed a friendship based on mutual respect and shared experience that transcended the dramatic circumstances of our initial meeting. His loyalty and courage during the investigation had probably saved my life, and I would be forever grateful for his willingness to help a virtual stranger. The emotional healing process had been more complex than the legal and financial resolutions. Learning that my own son had been willing to murder me for money had shattered fundamental assumptions about family loyalty and unconditional love that had shaped my entire adult life. The grief over losing Derek was in some ways more difficult than the grief over Richard's death, because Derek's betrayal had been a choice, while Richard's death had been the result of that betrayal. Therapy had helped me understand that Derek's actions reflected his own moral failures rather than any inadequacy in my parenting or family relationships. The therapist explained that some individuals are simply willing to prioritize their immediate desires over the welfare of others, regardless of how much love and support they have received throughout their lives. Learning to accept this reality without blaming myself had been one of the most challenging aspects of my recovery. I had used a significant portion of the inheritance money to establish Richard's Memorial Foundation for Elder Abuse Prevention, which provided education resources and support for seniors who were being exploited or manipulated by family members or caregivers. The foundation also funded research into detection methods for financial abuse and medical abuse, helping to develop better protection systems for vulnerable adults throughout California. The foundation's work had brought me into contact with dozens of other seniors who had experienced various forms of family betrayal and exploitation. Their stories helped me understand that my experience, while extreme, was part of a larger pattern of elder abuse that affected thousands of families throughout the country. Working to prevent others from experiencing similar betrayals had given my life a sense of purpose that helped balance the pain of what I had endured. My new home near Manhattan Beach provided the perfect environment for this new chapter of my life. The small cottage was just 2 blocks from the ocean, and I spent most mornings walking along the beach while planning foundation activities and reflecting on how dramatically my life had changed over the past year. The sound of the waves and the sight of the endless horizon had become my daily reminders that life continues and healing is possible even after the most devastating betrayals. The foundation had also become a way to honor Richard's memory in a manner that reflected his values and his commitment to protecting people from exploitation and fraud. He would have been proud of the work we were doing to help other families avoid the kind of manipulation and abuse that had destroyed our own family. Every senior citizen we helped represented a small victory against the kind of evil that Derek and Brittany had brought into our lives. Speaking at community centers and senior organizations about recognizing warning signs of elder abuse had become one of my most important activities. Sharing my story helped other seniors understand that family relationships do not automatically guarantee safety or protection, and that maintaining independence and awareness is crucial regardless of how trustworthy family members may appear to be. The most important lesson I had learned was that real family consists of people who genuinely care about your welfare and happiness, not simply people who share your DNA or legal relationships. Eddie had shown more loyalty and courage in protecting me than my own son had demonstrated throughout his entire adult life. Mrs. Patterson had provided more genuine support during my crisis than Derek had offered during my supposed time of need. My final reflections centered on the importance of trusting your own instincts and observations, even when everyone around you is suggesting that your concerns are unfounded or unreasonable. The subtle signs that something was wrong in my household had been present from the beginning, but I had allowed Brittany's manipulation and my own grief to override my natural skepticism and caution. Learning to trust myself again had been essential to rebuilding my confidence and independence. The justice system had worked exactly as it should in this case, but I knew that many elder abuse situations never reached the courts because victims were too isolated, confused, or intimidated to seek help. The Foundation's educational programs emphasized that seeking help at the first sign of trouble was always better than waiting until the situation became life-threatening, and that professional resources were available to assist seniors who found themselves in dangerous or exploitative relationships. As I finished writing this account of my experience, I realized that sharing my story publicly might help other families recognize similar warning signs before tragedies occurred. The pain of losing Richard and Derek would never completely disappear, but using that pain to prevent others from experiencing similar losses had given meaning to suffering that might otherwise have been simply devastating. Have you ever noticed warning signs of manipulation or exploitation in your own family relationships? And what steps did you take to protect yourself or your loved ones? I would love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below, as sharing these stories helps all of us learn to recognize and prevent elder abuse in our communities. Please like this video if my story helped you understand the importance of trusting your instincts and seeking help when something feels wrong in your family relationships. Subscribe to this channel to hear more stories about overcoming betrayal and finding justice when the people closest to you become your greatest threats. And please share this video with anyone who might benefit from learning about the warning signs of elder abuse and financial exploitation. Thank you for listening to my story and for supporting the work that helps protect vulnerable seniors from those who would exploit their trust and love. Remember that real strength comes from recognizing when you need help and having the courage to reach out for support, even when the people threatening you are the ones you trusted most. Stay safe, trust your instincts, and never hesitate to seek justice when someone violates that trust.